Imagine living in a town where the people meant to protect you were the very ones who made you afraid to step outside after dark. In the deep South of the 1960s, many black families in Louisiana faced this reality every single day. It was not just an uneasy feeling, it was the constant shadow of danger. The Ku Klux Klan operated openly, and far too often the local authorities, the very sheriffs and officials sworn to uphold the law, looked the other way or even stood side by side with those who threatened black lives. This was a time when simply registering to vote could bring a death sentence. Churches were burned. Families were terrorized. Innocent men and women were followed, harassed, and attacked, all for daring to claim the basic rights promised to every American. Imagine knowing that calling the police for help might only invite more danger. It was a world where silence could mean survival and speaking out could mean you never came home. But in this climate of fear, something unexpected happened. A group of determined black men decided they would no longer be silent, and they would no longer wait for someone else to protect their families. They were fathers, veterans, and hard-working citizens who had seen enough. Their courage sparked one of the most extraordinary and often overlooked chapters of the civil rights era. These men organized themselves not as aggressors but as protectors. They believed in dignity, in the right to live without terror, and in standing firm against those who tried to keep them down. Their presence alone began to change the balance of power in their town. For the first time, those who spread hate and intimidation were forced to think twice before acting. Tonight, we are diving into the powerful story of these unsung heroes, the men who stood up when the law would not, and whose bravery sent shockwaves far beyond their own community. Their fight was not about vengeance. It was about survival, justice, and the simple right to live free from fear. If you care about stories of courage that reshaped history, you are in the right place. This journey through the hidden chapter of America's past will challenge how you think about resistance and the meaning of true heroism. Before we begin, if you are inspired by stories of people who dared to stand against injustice, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next incredible piece of history we uncover. Your support helps us bring more powerful, untold stories to light, stories the world needs to remember. Now, let us step back to Louisiana in 1964, where the courage of a few would inspire many, and where an unforgettable stand for justice would forever change the struggle for civil rights. The fear that settled over Louisiana in the early 1960s was not born in a single night. It had been building like a gathering storm across the South. For generations, acts of racial violence had been whispered about behind closed doors. But in the years leading up to 1964, those whispers erupted into events so shocking that even the nation could not look away. In 1961, the quiet determination of a man named Herbert Lee collided head-on with the brutal reality of a system desperate to keep black citizens silent. Lee was not a public figure in the way we think of activists today. He was a farmer, a father of 9, a man who believed that prosperity and dignity could be built through hard work. He raised dairy cattle and grew cotton, creating a stable life for his family in Mississippi. Yet he also believed in something that the forces of hate found even more dangerous than his success. He believed in the power of the vote. Lee helped his neighbors register, encouraged them to stand up for their rights, and for that simple act of civic engagement he paid the ultimate price. One day, while assisting civil rights workers, Herbert Lee was confronted and shot in broad daylight. His life ended on a dusty road, his murder witnessed by many. Yet the killer walked free without fear of punishment. The message was clear. Anyone who dared to challenge the old order, no matter how quietly or peacefully, could be erased without consequence. Just 2 years later, another act of terror shattered any illusion that such violence was isolated. In September 1963, a Sunday morning in Birmingham, Alabama began like so many others. Children pressed freshly ironed clothes. Families filled pews, and the church bells of the 16th Street Baptist Church rang out to call the faithful to prayer. But that morning, hidden beneath the steps of the church, a bomb had been planted. At 10:22 a.m. the explosion tore through the building with a roar that rattled windows for blocks. The blast killed 4 young girls: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, each of them barely in their teens. Their lives cut short in the very place where they sought peace. The bombing injured more than 20 others and left the city stunned. The crime was no random act. It was a calculated warning aimed at a community daring to demand equality. The images of twisted pews, shattered stained glass, and the grieving families quickly spread across the country, and for many Americans who had turned away from the struggle for civil rights. The horror of that day forced them to confront the brutal reality that children were not even safe in their own sanctuary. These 2 tragedies, though separated by time and place, carried the same chilling truth. They revealed that the fight for equality was not simply a political debate or a legal question to be settled in courtrooms and legislatures. It was a matter of life and death. For the Black communities of the South, the danger was ever present and deeply personal. To attempt something as basic as registering to vote or gathering to worship could mean risking everything. The killings of Herbert Lee and those young girls were not random explosions of hate. They were deliberate signals sent by those who wanted to keep a people frightened and quiet. The perpetrators sought to make an example of anyone who dared to challenge their power, to show that the cost of courage could be paid in blood. Yet these acts of terror also carried consequences their perpetrators never intended. Instead of silencing the movement, they hardened the resolve of those who refused to live in fear. Each funeral became a gathering place not just for mourning but for commitment. Each act of violence made it clearer that waiting for change or relying solely on distant promises of justice was no longer enough. Men and women across the South began to realize that defending their lives and their dignity would require more than speeches or petitions. It demanded a willingness to protect their families and their communities in the face of danger that the law itself often refused to confront. In Louisiana, these events struck like a thunderclap. The memory of Herbert Lee's murder and the image of a bombed church were not distant news stories. They were warnings that the same fate could arrive on any given day. The Ku Klux Klan operated with brazen confidence, and the local authorities, who should have been guardians of peace, were often members or silent allies. For many Black residents, calling the police was no protection. It was an invitation for further harm. In this tense and hostile landscape, a small group of men began to imagine a different response. They were fathers and veterans, men who had worn the uniform of the United States military and returned home to find that the freedom they had fought for abroad was still denied to their own families. They had watched as peaceful protests were met with night riders and burning crosses, and they understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their lives and the lives of their loved ones could not depend on the goodwill of those who despised them. The stories of Herbert Lee and the Birmingham girls became more than cautionary tales. They became rallying cries. They were stark reminders that the old strategy of waiting and hoping for protection from the very institutions that allowed these horrors to happen was no longer enough. From this crucible of grief and defiance, the resolve grew stronger. If the law would not shield them, they would have to shield themselves. Out of this determination, the idea of organized self-defense began to take shape, leading directly to the creation of a group whose quiet discipline and readiness to act would soon challenge the entire balance of power in the South. The Deacons for Defense and Justice were not born from a desire for confrontation, but from the undeniable truth that the right to live in safety sometimes must be defended by those who refuse to be victims. Their story began in the long shadow of these murders, and it was the memory of those lives stolen that gave their mission its unshakable purpose. By the winter of 1964, the air in Louisiana carried a tension that could almost be felt on the skin. attention sharpened by the memory of Herbert Lee's daylight killing and the haunting images of the church bombing in Birmingham. Families who still trembled at every knock on the door and every car that slowed outside their homes knew that the danger was not fading with time. If anything, it was closing in the small industrial town of Jonesboro. A handful of men began to meet in quiet corners of churches and back rooms. Men who were no strangers to discipline or courage. Ernest Chili Willie Thomas had worn the uniform of the United States military in Korea and had learned, far from home, that bravery is not a word but a habit. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, a minister and civil rights activist, had preached about faith and justice long enough to know that faith without action was not enough. Both men understood that the South's terror was not just a mood, it was a system. And that system would not be broken by words alone. Thomas carried the memory of military service, of nights spent under foreign skies, of training that taught him how to keep calm when the world around him shook. He had seen men stand firm when every instinct said to run. And he had brought that steel back with him to Louisiana. But in his own hometown, the enemy was not an army across an ocean but neighbors whose faces he recognized. Men who wore suits by day and hoods by night. Men who could sit in the front pew on Sunday and stalk a black family after dark. Kirkpatrick, for his part, had spent years trying to protect his congregation with sermons and prayers. Yet he too knew that prayer alone would not stop a brick through a window or a torch at a doorstep. Together they spoke in hushed voices of the pattern they could no longer ignore. Law enforcement that turned its head, courts that shrugged, and mobs that acted with the certainty that no one would hold them accountable. Out of those late-night conversations came a simple but radical idea. If the law would not defend their community, then the community would have to defend itself. It was not a call for violence, and it was not born from anger. It was born from the deep and quiet knowledge that the right to live without fear was as sacred as any right written on paper. They knew they would be accused of stirring trouble, of threatening the peace. But the peace had already been broken by the bombs and the bullets. Their plan was not to attack but to shield. Not to seek revenge but to stand so firmly that the next Herbert Lee, the next 4 innocent girls, might be spared. Thomas and Kirkpatrick began to recruit men who shared not only their frustration but their discipline. They sought out veterans who understood chain of command, who knew how to keep their heads when fear would tempt others to rashness. They looked for fathers and workers whose lives were rooted in responsibility. Men who could be trusted to hold a weapon without letting pride or rage lead them astray. This was not an open invitation. It was a careful gathering of those who would protect rather than provoke. Each conversation carried weight, for they knew that a single reckless man could give their enemies the excuse they longed for. They called their group the Deacons for defense and justice, a name chosen with care. It reflected both their spiritual roots and their unshakable mission, to be guardians of their people's dignity. In the churches where they met, the word deacon meant service and stewardship. By adding the words for defense and justice, they made their purpose clear. They would serve their community not just with prayer and charity but with watchful courage. Their weapons were not symbols of aggression but tools of protection, as ordinary and as necessary as the locks on their doors. And with each quiet meeting, the men of Jonesboro began to weave a network of watchers. Men who would not fire the first shot, but who would not stand by while their neighbors were hunted. As the Deacons took shape, the lessons of the past few years guided their every move. They remembered Herbert Lee and the young girls of Birmingham not simply as victims, but as warnings of what happens when evil is allowed to roam unchallenged. Their resolve grew not from hatred but from love for their families, for the children who deserved to walk to school without trembling, for the elders who should have been able to sit on their porches without glancing over their shoulders. Every patrol, every late-night vigil, every plan to escort civil rights workers through hostile territory was an act of that love. Word of the Deacons began to travel, first as whispers and then as a rumor that carried through the towns of Louisiana. Some in the white community scoffed, dismissing them as a small band of dreamers. Others, more perceptive, felt a chill. For the first time in living memory, those who had used terror as a weapon were forced to consider the possibility that their targets might be ready to stand their ground. The balance of fear began to shift ever so slightly. It was not that the danger vanished, the Klan still moved in the night, and the authorities still turned their backs, but something fundamental had changed. The people who had been expected to bow their heads had begun, quietly and without fanfare, to raise them. From those first nights in Jonesboro, the Deacons for Defense and Justice would go on to influence towns across the South. But their beginning was rooted in the simple, unshakable conviction that a community has the right to defend itself when no one else will. Ernest Chilly Willie Thomas and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick did not set out to make history. They set out to keep their neighbors alive, yet in doing so, they forged a model of courage that would echo far beyond Louisiana and long after the sound of their footsteps faded. In the months that followed the quiet but resolute formation of the Deacons for Defense and Justice in Jonesboro, the idea of self-protection as a form of survival began to travel like an underground current through the black communities of Louisiana and beyond. The murders of Herbert Lee and the young girls in Birmingham still lingered like open wounds, and the men who had gathered under Ernest Chilly Willie Thomas and Frederick Douglass Patrick's leadership knew their efforts were only the beginning. As the Deacons' presence grew, the fear that had once silenced entire neighborhoods began to weaken. And in other towns where night riders prowled and law officers looked the other way, a similar determination took root. It was in Bogalusa, a paper mill town with a long history of labor unrest and racial tension, that three local leaders, Bob Hicks, Charles Sims, and Young, stepped forward to carry the torch. Bogalusa had always been a place of rough edges and restless energy. The smell of the paper mill clung to the air, and the rhythms of shift work dictated the pace of life. For black residents, those rhythms were often accompanied by an undercurrent of danger, a reminder that every small victory in civil rights could invite swift retaliation. Bob Hicks, a sawmill worker and father, had long been known for his quiet strength and his refusal to be intimidated. He had seen friends harassed and families threatened, and he understood that waiting for protection from City Hall or the sheriff's office was like waiting for rain in a drought. Charles Sims, a steady and thoughtful veteran, carried himself with the discipline of a man who had faced danger before and learned to stay calm when the stakes were highest. Young, whose voice carried both authority and warmth, had been active in voter registration drives and had witnessed firsthand how even the smallest steps toward equality could provoke sudden violence. These men were not seeking glory. They were answering a need that grew more urgent with every attack on civil rights workers and every night of whispered threats. Hicks, Sims, and Young met often in the evenings when the mill's hum faded and the streets emptied. They spoke in low tones, mindful that ears were everywhere, and weighed the lessons from Jonesboro. The example set by Thomas and Kirkpatrick had proven that a small band of determined men could shift the balance of fear without succumbing to recklessness. It was not about creating chaos or inviting confrontation. It was about ensuring that those who sought to terrorize their neighbors no longer acted without consequence. The three leaders agreed that if their town was to stand firm, it needed an organized, disciplined defense, one that mirrored the military precision of those who had served their country and returned with both skill and a deep understanding of responsibility. They began to gather men they knew they could trust, men whose sense of duty outweighed pride or anger. Many were veterans who had worn the nation's uniform in far-off lands. Men who had endured the strict codes of military life and knew that the calm hand is often stronger than the quick trigger. These were fathers, brothers, and churchgoers, men whose lives were built on hard work and quiet resolve. Their weapons were not tokens of aggression, but instruments of last resort. to be held only when no other option remained. Training sessions were held discreetly, sometimes in the backyards of trusted friends, where the crack of a rifle was muffled by the night. They drilled not only in marksmanship, but in the discipline of restraint, repeating again and again that their purpose was protection, not provocation. As word spread that Bogalusa's black residents were no longer defenseless, the atmosphere of the town began to shift. Those who had once moved through the darkness with impunity now found themselves hesitating. For the first time in years, the threat of unchecked violence was met with the knowledge that there were watchful eyes and steady hands ready to defend the vulnerable. The Armed Defense Unit, while small in number, carried a weight far beyond its size. It embodied the unspoken message that dignity and safety were not privileges to be granted by those in power, but rights to be secured by those who cherished them. The bond between the men grew stronger with each passing week. They shared not only a mission, but the quiet understanding of what was at stake: the lives of their children, the sanctity of their homes, the simple right to gather without fear. Their nights were long, often spent in silent patrols or tense vigils. Yet they carried their burden with a calm born of shared purpose. Their presence did not erase the danger hostile forces still lurked, and the machinery of discrimination did not suddenly disappear, but it did alter the calculations of those who sought to intimidate. The old balance, in which terror moved freely through the community, was beginning to crack. Hicks, Sims, and Young knew they were part of something larger than their own town. They had taken the lesson of Jonesboro and carried it forward, proving that courage and discipline could be as contagious as fear. They understood that the path to justice was long, and that their stand was but one step along it. Yet they also knew that every step mattered. In organizing their armed defense unit, these three men did more than protect their neighbors. They offered a living example of what it meant to turn fear into resolve, to transform vulnerability into strength. Their names would not always appear in the headlines, but their actions echoed through every family that slept a little easier, through every child who walked to school without glancing over a shoulder, and through every heart that dared to hope that dignity and safety could be claimed, even in the face of relentless opposition. From the very beginning, the men of the Deacons for Defense and Justice understood that their mission was not to mirror the hatred or violence of those who threatened them, but to create a shield strong enough to protect their families and neighbors when the law failed to do so. The tragedies that had already unfolded: the brutal killing of Herbert Lee, the bombing of the Birmingham church that stole the lives of 4 young girls, the nightly harassment of those who dared to register to vote had left them with no illusions. Words and peaceful protests alone had not been enough to keep the danger at bay. Yet these men, veterans and fathers, men shaped by discipline and by faith, also knew that to abandon the moral core of their struggle would be to lose something far more precious than any victory. They made a solemn commitment. They would not be the first to raise a weapon, but neither would they allow their children to be targets without answer. This pledge was more than a statement of principle. It became the very backbone of their strategy. In an era when the most visible leaders of the civil rights movement, figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., preached the transformative power of nonviolence, the Deacons stood as a quiet, controversial counterpoint. They did not seek to discredit nonviolent protest. In fact, many among them admired the courage it took to march unarmed into hostile territory, but they had seen too many nights when mobs moved in darkness, too many mornings when families found their homes riddled with bullets or set ablaze, and too many pleas for protection that went unanswered. They believed that a community's right to defend its own was not a betrayal of the civil rights cause, but a necessary safeguard to ensure it could continue. Bob Hicks, Charles Sims, Z. Young and their fellow Deacons trained with the same care and discipline they had once given to their military service. They met quietly after work, in backyards and basements, not to plot aggression, but to prepare for the moments when words and prayers might not be enough. Each gathering began with reminders of their purpose. They recited their pledge like a prayer. They would never provoke a fight, never seek to harm, but they would stand firm if attacked. Their rifles and shotguns, kept clean and ready, were not symbols of anger but of duty. It was a discipline born not of hatred, but of love, the love of children sleeping soundly in their beds. The love of wives and parents who deserved to wake to a morning free from fear. This approach tested the boundaries of the broader movement. Some national leaders worried that even the appearance of armed defense might give opponents an excuse to dismiss civil rights activists as dangerous radicals. But in places like Bogalusa and Jonesboro, where local authorities often turned their backs or even shared sympathies with those who spread terror, the Deacons' presence created a deterrent that no speech could match. When night riders considered attacking a home or disrupting a march, they now had to wonder if a silent watchman waited in the dark. That hesitation was not born from bravado. It was the direct result of men willing to shoulder a burden that no one else would. The tension between nonviolence and self-defense became, in many, a reflection of the complex reality of the movement itself. Public marches and boycotts captured headlines, but away from the cameras many communities survived only because someone was willing to stand guard. The Deacons' commitment to controlled, disciplined protection allowed these two strategies to coexist. Nonviolent protest could continue, drawing attention to the injustice, because someone else quietly ensured that the protesters would live to march again. Their guns were not carried in defiance of nonviolence, but in quiet service to it, a paradox that those who never faced nightly threats often struggled to understand. There were nights when their resolve was tested. A rumor of an impending attack would spread through the neighborhood like a sudden wind, and men would take their posts. Hearts steady, eyes sharp. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes a car slowed near a darkened house and then rolled on. On those nights the Deacons' vow was strongest, for the temptation to act preemptively was always there. But they held fast to their promise. They would not fire first. They would not become what they opposed. Their strength lay not only in the weapons they carried, but in the restraint they practiced. As the seasons passed, their presence began to change the rhythm of life in their towns. Parents allowed their children to play outside a little longer. Voter registration meetings continued without the constant fear of midnight raids. The Deacons knew that their work would not be celebrated in newspapers or praised in speeches, but the small, steady victories each night of undisturbed sleep, each rally that ended without bloodshed, were their true reward. Their pledge, simple yet profound, became a quiet force shaping the civil rights struggle. It showed that courage could take many forms, that the determination to protect life and dignity could stand alongside the call for peaceful change. By refusing to be passive victims yet refusing also to become aggressors, they carved a path that challenged the era's rigid lines between nonviolence and action. In doing, the Deacons for Defense and Justice ensured that the movement for equality was not only a battle of words and marches, but a testament to the many kinds of bravery required to bend the arc of history toward justice. The long, humid evening settled over Bogalusa like a heavy cloak as the marchers set out, their steps deliberate, their voices lifted in songs of resolve that drifted into the fading light. Families had gathered at the edges of the road, some holding candles that flickered in the warm breeze, others gripping the hands of children who sensed the tension in the air even if they could not name it. For weeks the community had braced for this moment, aware that every peaceful demonstration carried a risk far greater than the simple act of walking together. The Deacons for Defense and Justice had prepared carefully, each man reminding himself of the pledge that guided their mission. They would not provoke violence, but neither would they allow terror to crush their neighbors once again. Among them that night was Henry Austin, a quiet man known for his steady presence and for the calm authority that came from years of service and a deep sense of duty. Like his fellow Deacons, Austin carried not the thrill of confrontation but the weight of responsibility. He had kissed his family goodbye before leaving home, aware that the night might bring danger, and he walked with the certainty of someone who understood that courage is often the choice to stand firm when fear would be easier. The march began in the glow of dusk, the hymns of the crowd mixing with the low hum of crickets, yet just beyond the ring of light cast by the candles, shadows stirred. As the marchers reached a stretch of road where the trees pressed close and the streetlights grew sparse, the sound of jeers broke through the singing. From the darkness emerged a group of men whose faces were set with hostility, their movements sharp and deliberate. The mob had waited for this vulnerable moment. When the marchers were far from the safety of the church and the watchful eyes of friendly neighbors, they stepped into the road with a suddenness meant to startle, their voices rising in threats that echoed off the pines. The children in the crowd clung to their parents, and a hush fell over the marchers, the songs fading into the night. Henry Austin moved slightly ahead, his senses sharpening as he recognized the danger. The Deacons had anticipated that this might happen. It was for moments like this that they had spent long nights in quiet training and long days wrestling with the moral weight of their pledge. He could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question pressing in on everyone present. Would the march end in violence? Another tragedy added to the litany of names and places already scarred into the history of the movement. The mob advanced, their threats turning to shouts, their steps quickening. Austin raised his hand, signaling the other deacons to hold their ground. He did not rush. He did not speak. Instead, with a slow and deliberate motion, he lifted his rifle toward the sky. For a heartbeat the night seemed to pause, the only sound the restless rustle of the trees. Then he fired a single shot upward, a sharp crack that split the darkness and rolled like distant thunder through the humid air. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. The mob, which had moments earlier surged forward with reckless confidence, stumbled to a halt. Faces that had been hard with menace now flickered with uncertainty. The sudden, echoing report of the warning shot carried a message that needed no words. The marchers were not alone, and they would not be easy prey. Austin lowered his rifle with the same steady motion, his eyes never leaving the men before him. He had not aimed at them. He had not sought to harm. But he had drawn a line that could not be crossed without consequence. For a long moment the two groups faced one another, the night heavy with the possibility of what might come next. Then, slowly at first, the mob began to retreat. One by one they stepped back into the shadows from which they had emerged, their anger cooled by the unmistakable reality that their intimidation had met an unshakable wall. The marchers, though shaken, began to move again, their voices rising once more in song, this time quieter, but carrying a deeper strength. That single warning shot became more than an act of protection. It was a turning point, a living demonstration that the Deacons' philosophy of disciplined self-defense could hold back the tide of terror without betraying the core of the movement. Henry Austin's action did not ignite chaos. It prevented it. In that charged instant he embodied the delicate balance the Deacons had pledged to maintain, showing that measured, responsible defense could safeguard the right to protest and preserve the lives of those who dared to stand for justice. News of the night spread quickly through the community and beyond. For those who had doubted whether the presence of the Deacons truly mattered, the answer was now undeniable. The marchers had finished their journey unharmed, and those who sought to silence them had been forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. Intimidation would no longer go unanswered. The warning shot echoed far beyond that dark road, a sound that traveled through towns and churches, through whispered conversations and late-night meetings, carrying with it a quiet but powerful message. The Deacons for Defense and Justice had never claimed to be saviors or to seek glory. They were men who loved their families and their communities, who understood that freedom required more than hopeful words. That night in Bogalusa, Henry Austin proved that the simple courage to act with discipline and restraint could protect a movement whose heart remained committed to justice and dignity. The march continued, the songs returned, and the long struggle pressed forward, strengthened by the knowledge that fear no longer held the final word. Word of that tense night in Bogalusa traveled far beyond the pine forests of Louisiana, carried first by local whispers and then by the insistent voices of journalists who sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding in the Deep South. When the story of the march and Henry Austin's single warning shot reached the ears of national reporters, it became impossible for officials in Washington to dismiss what was happening as just another isolated clash in a long and painful struggle. For years, the federal government had treated the violence that shadowed black communities as a regional matter, a grim reality to be addressed with speeches and symbolic gestures. But the Deacons for Defense and Justice had changed the conversation. Their very existence, disciplined and unyielding, signaled that ordinary citizens had grown tired of waiting for protection and had chosen to guard their own lives and the right to demand justice. In the corridors of power, this was not merely another news story. It was a direct challenge to the assumptions that had guided national policy. President Lyndon B. Johnson had built his legacy on the promise of civil rights, signing landmark legislation and speaking of equality with soaring rhetoric. Yet on the ground in places like Bogalusa, those promises often went unfulfilled as local officials turned a blind eye or worse to the intimidation that stalked black neighborhoods. The Deacons' presence made that gap impossible to ignore. The sight of disciplined men standing watch with the quiet determination of those who had sworn to defend their families and neighbors sent a clear signal that communities would no longer endure terror in silence. Reports flowed into Washington describing not only the danger of unchecked violence, but the remarkable restraint of the Deacons themselves. These were not reckless vigilantes but veterans and fathers, men whose service to their country and communities was beyond question. Their actions forced federal officials to face a reality they had long postponed. If the government would not uphold the law, others would step in to fill the void. That reality carried both a warning and an opportunity. To allow matters to escalate unchecked risked a wider conflict. To respond decisively could reinforce the federal commitment to civil rights and show that the promise of equality was more than words. President Johnson, who understood both the moral and political stakes, could not afford inaction. Behind doors, advisors debated how to prevent further bloodshed and how to demonstrate federal resolve without undermining the nonviolent ideals cherished by many in the movement. The Deacons had not sought to embarrass the administration, but their very success in protecting marchers highlighted the government's own failures. Johnson recognized that to preserve the credibility of his civil rights agenda he had to act. The images of armed black men standing firm against intimidation left no room for delay. The decision came to deploy the National Guard, a visible force of federal authority intended to make clear that the United States would not tolerate continued assaults on its citizens. Troops arrived in Louisiana not to confront the Deacons but to reinforce the principle that law and order could no longer be dictated by fear. For families who had lived too long under the shadow of night riders and the threat of violence, the sight of federal soldiers offered a measure of relief, an acknowledgement that their cries for protection had finally reached the highest levels of government. But the response did not end with the Guard's arrival. Pressured by the growing evidence of systematic intimidation, the Justice Department moved to take legal action against those who had orchestrated and condoned acts of terror. Investigators gathered testimony and documented the pattern of threats, arson, and assaults that had become the ugly backdrop of Southern life. For the first time, the federal government sought to restrain the Klan and its allies through the courts, filing suits that accused them of conspiring to deny fellow citizens their constitutional rights. This was not a sudden moral awakening, but the result of sustained pressure from communities that refused to be silenced and from the Deacons who embodied the determination to survive and protect. Their quiet but unmistakable strength created a political reality Washington could not sidestep. It was one thing to read reports of attacks on unarmed demonstrators. It was quite another to confront the fact that disciplined defenders were now willing to stand their ground, insisting that the government meet its own obligations. The legal actions that followed set important precedents. By taking aim at those who used fear to suppress the vote and terrorize their neighbors, the federal government signaled that racial intimidation would no longer be tolerated as a local custom. The suits that emerged from these investigations laid the groundwork for future efforts to dismantle organized hate groups and to hold their members accountable in court. For many black residents, the change was not immediate and the struggle remained arduous. But the intervention marked a turning point. In the streets of Bogalusa and in other communities where the Deacons stood guard, the knowledge that the highest office in the land had finally responded carried profound meaning. It was an acknowledgement of their humanity and of the principle for which they risked so much, that every citizen deserved protection under the law. Henry Austin's warning shot had echoed far beyond that dark Louisiana road, reaching the marble halls of Washington and awakening a government that had too often been slow to act. The federal response did not erase the hardships that lay ahead, nor did it fully bridge the chasm of injustice that had built up over generations. Yet it demonstrated something powerful and enduring, that the courage of ordinary people, organized and resolute, could compel even the most distant authorities to reckon with their duty. The Deacons for Defense and Justice had not merely protected their neighbors on a single night. They had forced a nation to confront its own promises and, in doing, had altered the course of the civil rights struggle in ways that would resonate for decades to come. In the tense atmosphere of the mid-1960s, as the Deacons for Defense and Justice grew in both reputation and influence, their very existence became a source of deep unease within the highest levels of the federal government. J. Edgar Hoover, who had ruled the Federal Bureau of Investigation with an iron grip for decades, viewed the Deacons not as a group of fathers and veterans determined to safeguard their families, but as a potential spark that could ignite something larger than the civil rights movement itself. To Hoover, any form of organized black self-defense, even one that openly pledged to protect, rather than provoke, was more unsettling than the white supremacist organizations that had been terrorizing black communities for generations. He feared that if the Deacons' model of disciplined, armed protection spread, it would undermine the Bureau's narrative that change had to come slowly, through institutions and quiet negotiation. Hoover's suspicion translated swiftly into action. He ordered the same covert tactics that had long been used to destabilize political opponents and social movements. Under his direction, the FB launched a program of infiltration and surveillance designed to sow distrust within the ranks of the Deacons. Informants were recruited sometimes through intimidation, other times with promises of leniency for unrelated troubles to attend meetings and report every detail, from the tone of a Sunday night gathering to the movements of key leaders. Agents compiled meticulous files on men like Bob Hicks, Charles Sims, and Z. Young, not because these leaders advocated violence, but because they dared to argue that black lives were worth defending with both courage and, if necessary, arms. The irony was glaring. For years, civil rights activists had pleaded for federal protection from the very groups that now received far less scrutiny from the FBI than the Deacons themselves. While Hoover's Bureau pursued the Deacons with a near-obsessive focus, the Ku Klux Klan and other violent organizations often slipped through the cracks of federal attention. Local black communities knew this imbalance all too well. They watched federal agents meticulously shadow men who merely wished to keep their families alive, while white supremacist violence burned churches. Midnight cross-burnings and drive-by shootings too often went unpunished. It was a bitter lesson in the politics of power and perception. In the eyes of Washington's most powerful law enforcement officer, the notion of black men legally bearing arms for defense represented a greater challenge to the status quo than the overt acts of terror. carried out by the Klan. Despite the weight of Hoover's scrutiny, the Deacons remained remarkably disciplined. Their leadership anticipated infiltration and counseled their members to stay united, to resist the temptation to boast, and to keep their mission focused. They refused to allow the presence of informants or the knowledge of constant surveillance to fracture their resolve. Instead, the pressure forged a deeper bond among those who stood guard at night, who escorted children to newly integrated schools, who quietly shadowed civil rights marches with weapons carefully hidden but ready if needed. The Deacons understood that their strength did not lie in numbers or firepower alone, but in the trust and solidarity of their community. The surveillance campaign revealed something else about the Deacons: their ability to endure under constant suspicion without losing their moral compass. They never sought to provoke conflict or to supplant the broader civil rights movement strategy of peaceful protest. Rather, they complemented it, providing a protective shield that allowed marches, sit-ins, and voter registration drives to continue in places where unprotected activists might have faced lethal retaliation. Even as Hoover's agents compiled reports and whispered rumors into the ears of journalists and politicians, the Deacons held fast to their promise that their weapons would never be used for aggression, only for defense when every other avenue failed. This resilience did more than frustrate the FBI. It exposed the contradictions at the heart of American democracy. The same government that professed to champion freedom and justice placed under surveillance a group whose only crime was to insist that those promises applied equally to black citizens. Hoover's campaign to paint the Deacons as dangerous backfired in subtle ways. For every attempt to discredit them only highlighted the vacuum of protection that had made their existence necessary. When communities across Louisiana and Mississippi spoke of the nights when Deacons kept watch, of the moments when their quiet presence deterred would-be attackers, the story that emerged was not one of radicals threatening the nation, but of neighbors defending the very principles the nation claimed to hold sacred. Over time, the FBI's efforts to infiltrate and intimidate failed to dismantle the Deacons. They would not be defined by the labels Hoover tried to affix to them. Their legacy became instead a testament to the courage of ordinary men who refused to surrender their right to live without fear. They showed that self-defense, when tempered by discipline and a clear moral purpose, could stand alongside nonviolent protest as a legitimate and even necessary form of resistance. Hoover's campaign of surveillance, meant to cast them as villains, inadvertently underscored their importance. The Deacons endured not by avoiding the gaze of power, but by standing unshaken beneath it, proving that a community united in defense of its dignity could withstand even the most determined efforts to break its spirit. By the late 1960s, as the first chapters of the Deacons for Defense and Justice began to fade from the nightly headlines, their influence had already seeped far beyond the Louisiana towns and Mississippi back roads where they first stood guard. What started as a quiet, disciplined network of veterans and working men determined to shield their families from terror evolved into a powerful template for a new generation of black activists. Their model of organized community defense built on discipline, a clear moral code, and an unyielding commitment to protecting life would become the blueprint for one of the most recognizable movements of the era, the Black Panther Party. The Panthers would gain national attention and controversy, but behind their striking imagery and bold programs lay lessons first tested in the small, tense towns where the Deacons made their stand. The Deacons had demonstrated that community defense was not a reckless act of defiance, but a carefully considered necessity when the state refused to protect its own citizens. They had proved that black men and women could organize with military precision while staying rooted in the ideals of justice and equality. For young activists watching the nightly news from Oakland, Los Angeles, and Chicago, this lesson was electric. They saw how the Deacons had faced down threats without descending into chaos, how their steady courage forced local authorities and even the federal government to acknowledge the right of black communities to exist without fear. These examples of dignity and self-respect resonated deeply with Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale as they shaped the founding principles of the Black Panther Party in 1966. When the Panthers launched their patrols to monitor police behavior in Oakland, they were following a path the Deacons had cleared. The Deacons had already shown how to organize armed patrols without becoming the aggressor, how to pair vigilance with community service, and how to make the presence of protection a rallying point for civic pride, rather than a symbol of intimidation. Their quiet strength revealed that a visible, disciplined presence could deter violence more effectively than any speech or petition. The Panthers absorbed this wisdom and expanded it, applying it to urban neighborhoods where police brutality and systemic neglect demanded a visible response. But the Deacons' influence went deeper than tactics. They had understood that defense meant more than carrying arms. It meant safeguarding the dignity and future of the community. They protected not only marches and voter registration drives, but also the fragile hope of children who deserved to see adults standing tall in the face of hatred. The Panthers took that spirit and wove it into programs that reached every aspect of daily life: free breakfast for school children, community health clinics, political education classes, and legal. These initiatives were not a sudden invention, but the natural evolution of the Deacons' belief that true security came from a community that fed, taught, and healed its own. The parallels were unmistakable. Like the Deacons, the Panthers faced relentless government surveillance and infiltration. The same FBI that had targeted the quiet watchmen of Louisiana turned its full attention to the Black Panthers, launching covert operations designed to fracture their unity and paint them as a threat to national security. Hoover's tactics against the Panthers were even more aggressive, but the lessons of resilience that the Deacons had embodied offered a silent guide. They had endured constant scrutiny without losing their sense of purpose. And that example helped inspire the Panthers to hold their ground through some of the most turbulent years of the civil rights era. In many, the Deacons were the bridge between the nonviolent marches of the early 1960s and the more militant expressions of self-determination that followed. Their existence proved that self-defense and community care were not opposites but allies. They never sought to overshadow the nonviolent leaders of the movement. Instead, they created the space in which those leaders could work without fear of annihilation, by showing that a community could be both protective and principled, both disciplined and compassionate. The Deacons gave the Panthers a foundation on which to build a nationwide movement. This quiet lineage is often overlooked in the sweeping narratives of the 1960s, yet it explains much about how the era unfolded. Without the Deacons' demonstration that armed, disciplined defense could coexist with the larger fight for justice, the Panthers might have been dismissed as a radical departure from the civil rights struggle. Instead, they stood as a continuation, an urban echo of the rural watchmen who had once guarded church meetings and escorted children through hostile streets. The Panthers' bold imagery and sweeping programs captured national attention. But the moral architecture of their work, the conviction that communities had the right and responsibility to protect and care for themselves, was first built in the small towns of the Deep South. As the years passed, historians began to recognize the Deacons not merely as a footnote but as a turning point. Their courage shaped the possibilities of black activism in America, proving that self-determination could take many forms and that the defense of one's community was itself an act of profound civic faith. The Black Panther Party's rise to national prominence was the most visible testament to that legacy. In their patrols and programs, in their insistence that dignity demanded both protection and care, the Panthers carried forward the quiet but transformative lesson the Deacons had taught. That freedom is secured not only by laws and courts, but by communities willing to stand together, unafraid, and claim the right to live in safety and in pride. As the decade wore on and the fires of the civil rights struggle shifted into new arenas, the Deacons for Defense and Justice gradually faded from the headlines. Their chapters, once alive with late-night meetings and quiet patrols, began to close. Some members moved on to other forms of activism. Others returned to the steady rhythms of family and work. Yet the story they left behind was far more enduring than the lifespan of any single organization. The Deacons had proved something that could not be erased. When a community stands together with discipline and conviction, even the most entrenched systems of intimidation and injustice can be forced to bend. Their presence reshaped the very landscape of American democracy. Before the Deacons, it was dangerously easy for those in power to dismiss calls for civil rights as idealistic and fragile. But the Deacons' calm, organized self-defense forced officials at every level from local sheriffs to the White House to confront the reality that black citizens would no longer accept terror as an unavoidable fact of life. Their quiet patrols sent a message louder than any slogan. Freedom would not be begged for. It would be protected and lived. They never sought glory. They did not march for the sake of spectacle or to court national attention. Instead, their mission was rooted in something older and deeper. The simple right of every child to walk to school without fear, of every parent to gather in a church without wondering if a mob lurked outside. In defending these basic human rights, the Deacons illustrated a truth that stretched far beyond Louisiana's borders. Self-defense, when guided by moral clarity and collective responsibility, can be a powerful force for justice. Historians and activists looking back now see the Deacons as a vital bridge between eras. They stood at the meeting point of nonviolent protest and the rising call for black self-determination. They did not reject the principles of nonviolence, but they understood that ideals alone could not shield their neighbors from night riders and burning crosses. By holding both truths, valuing peace, yet preparing to protect their loved ones, they helped create space for the civil rights movement to succeed. Without their watchful courage, many marches, voter registration drives, and community meetings might never have taken place. The legacy of the Deacons lives on in every community organization that teaches empowerment, in every movement that blends courage with care, and in every reminder that ordinary people can make history when they refuse to be silent. They showed that change is not only forged in courtrooms and on picket lines, but also in the quiet determination of neighbors who look out for one another and stand united against fear. Their example continues to inspire those who believe that freedom is both a right and a responsibility. So as we close this chapter of American history, let us remember the men and women whose steadfast defense of their communities helped turn the tide of the civil rights era. Their story is more than a historical footnote. It is a testament to the power of collective action and the courage to defend what is right. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a powerful, often overlooked story of bravery and determination. If this history has inspired you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories to light, stories of people who stood together, protected one another, and proved that justice is never given. It is earned through courage and unity. Do not forget to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next exploration into the hidden chapters of our shared past. Together, we can keep these important memories alive and ensure that their lessons continue to guide us forward.